And Torsten, do you want to get us started?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm super happy to have Aydın Buluç here, and he's going to talk about parallelism and sparsity, two of the topics that I really like, and I'm looking very much forward to this talk and remain very curious. And Nikolai is going to give a formal, full introduction of all his achievements and accomplishments. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Torsten. And again, thank you, Aydın, for being here. And I don't think we have time to go over all of the accomplishments, so we'll just hit some highlights. Aydın's a staff scientist and PI at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in Berkeley, California, and also an adjunct assistant professor of EECS at UC Berkeley. He leads the Passion Lab, which I believe is split between both the university and the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. He was previously a Louis W. Alvarez postdoctoral fellow and a visiting scientist at the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing. His PhD came from UCSB in 2010. And a bachelor's in computer science from Sabancı University in Turkey. He is also a recipient of a Department of Energy Early Career Award and the IEEE TCSC Award for Excellence for Early Career Researchers. He's won best papers, had best paper nominees, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, Aydın, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai and Torsten, for having me and for the really nice introduction. Indeed, I just wanted to say one tiny advertisement. The Alvarez Fellowship at the lab, not that it's accepting applications at the moment, that's usually in the fall, but we decided this year that we're going to run a seminar series with all the previous Alvarez Fellows. Some of them are at national labs now, some of them are faculty on various departments around the world. Some of them even became researchers in industry. So you should be able to find that, or just if you're interested, email me. It's a group of eclectic researchers because all of us are in different fields of computing or applied mathematics. So those are really fun seminar series as well. Anyway, let me get to this topic of my talk today, which is going to be parallel sparse matrix algorithms, but with a twist towards data analysis and machine learning. Let me start by talking about what our group does as a Passion Lab. Passion stands for Parallel Algorithms for Scalable Sparse Computations, with a little bit of abuse in the acronym, like most people do. You can access our website at passion.lbl.gov, and our mascot is a passion flower, which kind of seems like one of the most beautiful flowers I have seen. It's like almost three-dimensional. So we get our motivations from applications in genomics, in graphs, in proteomics, machine learning, and we identify sparse matrix primitives, which are plentiful, in fact, in them, and design new data structures, new algorithms, and even standardization of these efforts. And then we do lots of parallel computing in lower bounds, new communication avoiding algorithms, or even data structures or programming techniques that will help us write sparse matrix code that will work for these algorithms. So it's like a nice virtuous cycle going on in here. Who does this work? Is all these pictures. Hopefully I haven't missed anyone so far. I try to update them as quickly as I can whenever I need to give a new talk. We have a group of students at UC Berkeley whom I co-advise with other faculty members, Kathy Alec or Jim Demel so far. And we have researchers at the laboratory and postdocs and some long-term visiting fellows. I have included them here as well. So let me start with what a sparse matrix is, because it's in the title. Some of the earliest codes about sparse matrices is due to Harry Markowitz, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, not necessarily for his sparse matrix work, but it's still a a good connection. He said, I observed that most of the coefficients in our matrices are 0, and if you take care, they will stay 0. And what he's really describing is the process of solving systems of sparse linear equations with something like Gaussian elimination or variance of it. Can be, I don't actually know in the particular case whether he's thinking about symmetric positive definite matrices or the general matrices. Either case, the same rules more or less apply with different data structures. And this whole process is there has been the workhorse of scientific computing and simulations. So the sparse matrix research technically originated from these techniques of solving sparse linear systems. And in fact, the first book I have gotten on this topic is really an ancient book called Sparse Matrix Technology, from an author whose name I can't remember, but this exact quote is the name of the book. So I'm sure you're going to find it. A lot of these techniques about how to avoid fill, how to choose data structures are going to be there. This is, of course, like a 30-year-old book. But this has been the name of the game for all sparse matrix research. And then there's iterative solvers for the same problem. But there, the data structure choices are even less interesting because most of it boils down into preconditioning plus some sort of sparse matrix vector multiply where the vector is dense. Today, I'm going to actually talk about sparse matrix research outside the domain of solvers. So I am not going to talk about simulations. I'm going to talk about data analysis and machine learning. And so those are really emerging uses of sparse matrix technology. And some of it has to do with the fact that, oh, we know what to do with these data structures, the decades of research. Can we actually use the same patterns for more interesting problems of our 21st century? And for data structures, maybe. For algorithms, we need to have a whole different selection of them. So let me start with my favorite primitive, which is sparse matrix multiply. Now, this is actually a fairly tricky title because you can mean many, many different things if you say sparse matrix multiply. And people kind of do that. And it gets really confusing. It takes you like 3 pages of reading a paper to understand what exact sparse matrix multiply they're solving. So I try to put a generalized treatment of this. So the way I define something to be a sparse matrix multiply is at least one of the matrices in this computation needs to be sparse. Okay, that's kind of the rule. There is input matrices A and B. There's an output matrix C. This can also be dense, but rarely is. And then there is a concept of a mask, which is something that's going to come up frequently today when I'm talking about it. In general, if the mask is there, it's assumed to be sparse. Mask dictates what entries on the output needs to be computed, and anything outside the mask you can just ignore. And some literature, this is called a sampling matrix. You just want a subsample of the results of the output, right? So naturally, if the mask is there, the output will be sparse too, right? Even if the inputs are dense. So here are the variants. The one that we call SPGEMM is where both inputs are sparse. The output is generally sparse, but sometimes depending on the application, it can be dense. If it's the inputs are long, short and wide, and tall and skinny respectively, the output will be a small matrix, and in usually it will have all its entries full, so it can be represented as a dense matrix, but more often it's sparse. A version of this, what I call a masked SPGEMM, which is also something I'm going to talk about, is the same as above, but with a mask present. So some entries are not needed, and this comes up often in graph analysis, graph traversal. In fact, I have seen it in tree-based machine learning inference, which is in the citations, but I'm not going to talk about it today. The other 2 things I'm going to focus today is SpMM, where the input matrix, one of the input matrices is sparse. The other input matrix, as well as the output, is dense. However, they're usually tall and skinny. So what that means is it's something like multiple vectors stacked together. And in this case, often there is no mask, or at least I'm not aware of. And finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is there are 2 input dense matrices, but there is a sampling matrix, or there is a mask, which tells you that only a subset of these products, inner products of A and B needs to be computed. And then you have probably heard about SPMV, which is just a degenerate case of SPMM with the B and C matrices having only one column, and SPM-SPV, which is a degenerate case of SPGEMM, where sparse matrix, sparse vectors, where the second input matrix as well as the output is only one column. So let me go over some applications of SPGEMM. I actually won't talk about particular algorithms, distributed memory algorithms for SPGEMM, because I've talked about them over the years so many times that I got a little bit tired of them. You can definitely find even a survey on that written by some other people. There's many algorithms. By the time I started working on this problem, I would say that there were just maybe 1.5 papers on this. So this is one of the problems that we were working on. Here you are given a set of DNA reads, which are what the sequencer outputs. And we represented them as R1 to R, God knows, R6 is, we have only 6 inputs. And the way people try to find overlaps between these reads is it's generally too expensive to compare all to all, which would require R square expensive Smith-Waterman calculation. So how to do the pairwise comparisons only on a small subset is they chop these DNA reads into shorter segments called k-mers of length k. Really, this is just a nucleotide, a continuous nucleotide of length k, contiguous. And they say, if 2 reads don't share a k-mer, then they probably won't overlap at all. So we might as well not even try running an expensive pairwise computation. And if you think about this, it's really, you want to write a matrix, which the rows are the reads, the columns are the k-mers, and you can subsample these k-mers, which any technology, there's many different ways of choosing good k-mers. You don't need to choose every single one of them. There's a lot of redundancy. But no matter how you choose them, you can still put this information into the sparse matrix of reads by k-mers. And if you multiply that with its transpose, you're automatically computing a value that says how many k-mers are shared between 2 reads. For each entry in the output, each non-zero entry in the output, this is telling you the number of shared k-mers. And now you can actually do everything you want as long as you can overload the operations of additions and multiplications in your matrix multiply code to keep track of the locations of these k-mers, to weigh them. Some of them are more important than the others. You can totally put weights on those. And this will allow you to actually, start, for example, a pairwise overlap on a particular place if you know the locations. So you can just use any SPGEMM algorithm, sparse matrix multiply. And that's what we had done in this work that was published in SciM ACDA. And there's a distributed memory version of this. In fact, beyond that, there's 2 distributed memory versions of this. This particular work relies on sparse matrices, the diBELLA.ZD, with 2-dimensional data distribution. That's where the name comes from. We did more than just overlap detection. We also do a process called the transitive reduction, where we eliminate all the transitive edges from the graph, because that's required when you're about to find the DNA, which is linear, right? There's no transitive edges. You want to get to a graph that's as linear as possible so that you can just walk through it and say, this is the DNA I'm trying to put together. And this is of course runtime and everything, but how does it compare? What benefit did we get by using this primitive? We actually have, it's not a controlled experiment because it's different personnel in different years, but we did actually have 2 versions of this work. What we call a diBELLA.ZD is a more traditional hash table-based idea, which you say, okay, I have all my k-mers stored in a hash table, in a distributed hash table, and I'm just gonna, for each read, query that hash table for all the k-mers it has and find all the possible reads that it can align to. So that requires one-sided communication in general for performance, or big all-to-all Vs if you do it with MPI. diBELLA.ZD, using the sparse matrix abstraction, gives you this advantage that you can restructure the sparse matrix computation in 2-dimensional way, 3-dimensional way, and so on. So it gives you this whole knowledge of algorithms we already have. And and in some sense avoid communication doing so, mostly because of the abstraction difference. And then when we compared them, there was 2D was consistently faster across all scales. But the more interesting use was it, of course, because all the machinery was in place, I would say it took at least 5 to 10 times less effort coding-wise to get to a functioning code compared to the build a distributed hash table with one-sided communication or two-sided L2LV issues. So this was a lot of good work. And then we had facing this problem of finding something called the protein families. These are proteins that have similar sequence and usually do same function. They evolved from the same ancestry. I don't want to go actually too much into detail about what that means. It's called homology. Homologous proteins are like we have hemoglobin that carries oxygen to our cells, and you'll be surprised to see that there's an homologous protein even in a soybean. Right? There's something has to carry oxygen to the cell. It doesn't look like ours all that much because it has went through evolution of so many generations that the sequence identity can be pretty low to ours. It can be as low as 30%. But you can deduce that they're homologous. And the first step to do this process is to find, again, pairwise similarities between proteins, and then you will run some sort of graph clustering algorithm for the best results on that. The challenge was a little different here because in the DNA overlapping, we are trying to find DNA that sequence the same region. So we're looking for some sort of exact overlaps, at least partially, on our data up to certain error that comes from the sequencing machinery. Here, the signal we're trying to catch is much weaker because it went through, again, millennia, millions of years of evolution. So the kind of similarity we're trying to catch might not be possible with just exact k-mer matches. Any k-mer, even a k-mer as short as 7 mesh, will probably mutate into something different if the signal you're trying to catch is that low. Okay, so what could we do? We said, okay, there's a concept called substitute k-mers. We can use that idea where for each k-mer, we will create a table of all the closest k-mers. It could have mutated based on the rules we know for evolution. And these rules are really like these scoring matrices. It says, what are the chances of S mutating into E? And then there is a penalty for that, right? So on. And then you can encode this information, build a table. Now, magically, you can use that table and put it in a sparse matrix as well, not surprisingly. So this substitution matrix becomes, for each exact k-mer, what are their potential substitutes matrix? So it's an k-mers by k-mers matrix. Now, if I want to use an inexact matching between protein sequences, instead of doing what I've done, which is A times A transpose with the DNA sequencing, now I can do A times S times A transpose. Now, this is not only going to find all the exact k-mer matches between two protein sequences, but it will also find any inexact matches because it's going through this substitute matrix. And the same code you can reuse from sparse matrix multiply, whatever fancy algorithm you have and robust implementation you have. But again, you need to have a different semi-ring for that because the rules of the multiplication are potentially different here. And this was an SC20 paper. You can read more about that work. It was very fun, and we're still working on that to make it better in different dimensions. And when we actually benchmarked this thing in terms of accuracy, it was actually pretty close to the state of the art that stuff people actually use in biology day to day. It's really hard to compare two different results when you have multiple dimensions of quality, where precision and recall. So we kind of plotted this thing, and you can see that the PASTIS, which is the software we add, I think it stands for protein alignment to sparse matrices or something like that. The acronym should be in the paper. It is it's Pareto optimal in certain configurations, so that's all that matters. It's not dominated by the alternatives, but it scales fairly well, and it's much better now actually. So that's the application use cases of SPGEMM. I want to move to why I've even mentioned something called the Masked SPGEMM, right? And this came up over and over again in the last decade when we were writing graph algorithms in the language of linear algebra. And we noticed that the temporaries that we were generating was kind of, it was very scalable code, but there was some factors that was missing in the performance. We were like a 2 to 3x slower in many cases. And here is actually why this was happening. The sparse matrix multiplier we were using would generate the output, and then look at the output and see what parts of it we don't need. So why do we need that? Let's look at multi-source breadth first search, which is you're doing a breadth first search on a graph with different starting vertices. So you can write this down as a sparse matrix that represents the adjacency of the graph times another sparse matrix that represents, for each column, the current frontier. The starting vertex is going to be the first column initially, but then it will get denser as more vertices are introduced in the frontier, and then it will finally get sparser again because there's fewer and fewer vertices to discover. So it's every iteration we're kind of pruning the out entries that are already being discovered before from our output and making that our next input to the multiplication and iteratively doing this thing. Now, the catch here is at some point, the things that we have already discovered becomes like 50% of everything we want to discover. So like half of the vertices at that point are discovered and we don't need them again. However, we will just generate the output and then redundantly and eliminate them. A more succinct way of writing this down is to say there is a mask, which is the complement of the things that you have already discovered so far in all your previous iterations. And we don't need to rediscover them again. Those are kind of inactive vertices at this point. They're not discoverable. So the algorithm should figure out a way to not even materialize them or even not do the computation that is needed for them. So that's what we call a masked SPGEMM. That's the kind of the output we don't want or we want, depending on the application. And actually, the first thing that made us realize this was the triangle count, right? Triangle counting can be written very succinctly in linear algebra form. This is actually a slightly inefficient version. L times L is just enough, but I like this figure a little more, where you can say, you can actually do this many different ways. Here, we're dividing the adjacency matrix into two pieces. The L part has all the vertices that, all the edges where it goes from a high numbered node to a low numbered node, and the U part is the opposite. So here you're kind of trying to list all the wedges. A wedge is a triangle that doesn't have the third closing edge. And then you check whether that wedge is closing. You can do it with A squared too. You're just going to be counting 6 times more things than you need to. Here I'm counting twice as much as I need to, and there is a way to count exactly as much as you do, which is L times L. But the trick there is I am generating all the wedges first and then checking if they close. That's actually very expensive if the ratio of the wedges to triangles are high. Instead, what I can say is, hey, I have this mask, which is my output. Now, the edges I have, don't even enumerate the wedges if the closing piece of the triangle is not there, right? So that's what kind of motivated us to do masked SPGEMM. And the final thing I want to say here is the masking concept actually is so powerful in my mind is if this was in the library, an optimizing, let's say, compiler or domain-specific compiler would have discovered something known as pull-push optimization, which is direction optimizing graph traversal. Because what really happens in that level is you do know that some of the output is not available, because you've already computed those vertices, and you're trying to figure out the parts that you can get to, only the parts that you haven't discovered. So the algorithm, the compiler will automatically call a different implementation when the set of vertices that are discovered exceed a certain threshold. And that would automatically discover the direction optimizing search, also known as push-pull. But that's a conversation for another day. So let me go to some results and then some new ideas we had for this primitive. Now I successfully motivated this, hopefully, the masked SPGEMM. Again, the picture is on the top. There's two sparse matrices. We used to basically multiply them and then somehow force a mask on that output. And that means we have been redundantly computing a lot of entries. But if we actually use the mask to guide the computation, then we will probably avoid a lot of redundant computation. Now, you can look at this problem for about 15 seconds and just say, hey, I have a reasonable solution to this. Why don't I do inner products for each non-zero in the mask? If your mask is really sparse, that's actually okay, right? So you can, this is the simplest thing one can think of and easiest thing to implement. A GPU library GraphBLAS, I will mention towards the end if I have time, as well as the first versions of sparse GraphBLAS used to do that. They call it the dot product version. But if your mask is not that sparse, doing inner products, sparse inner products for each non-zero entry in the mask is not going to be that fast, actually. And I'll talk about other algorithms instead. So the general idea, this complicated picture, is somehow use this mask to, during the computation of the best known sparse matrix multiply algorithms, which are usually those that are variants of the so-called Gustafson's method. This has been rediscovered by many people. Gustafson wrote one of the most beautiful papers in 1978. It's titled like Too Fast Algorithm for Sparse Matrices Multiplication and Transposition. And there the idea is, right, you form the output row by row. You go over the entries of one of the sparse matrices. Usually if you're doing row by row, you go over the first sparse matrix. And then for each non-zero here, you find the corresponding row that it needs to merge. You merge them and write it to the output. Now what we're trying to do here is, how can I insert the mask concept here and make this faster? And really, there's many algorithms in this preprint, which is actually going to be presented as a poster sometime later this week in PPAP 2022 by Srijan. And of course, it's under review for the full version somewhere else. I'm just going to talk about one version of it. The idea here is there's a data structure called sparse accumulator, which allows, it's really a dense vector augmented with Boolean flags that tell which elements have already been introduced. And then you need some sort of sparse vector to kind of push into the indices, so you can output the SPA in time proportional to the number of non-zeros. So instead of blindly using SPA as a dense vector, what we use is we kind of set those Boolean flags. They're no longer Boolean. They have three states. It's either there, it's not inserted, or not allowed. And not allowed is really coming from mask. That's the new thing. We just set some entries as these entries of the output cannot exist. So initially everything is unallowed, and only the entries in the mask become allowed. And once you're inserting, it first checks this state. If it doesn't say allowed, it doesn't even do anything. And if it says allowed, then you can set it to be set, inserted to the output entries. And this version, even though it doesn't stop the computation of touching the input matrices, it does eliminate almost all writes that would be redundant, even the temporary writes into these values array and the dense vectors, because nothing passes this little states vectors. So it is surprisingly fast. And here's the proof. These are actually end-to-end codes, as opposed to just sparse matrix multiply. Instead of creating a lot of artificial setup, we just said, what if we plugged our code into between the centrality that we talked? What if we plugged our code into K-trust or triangle counting? So these three plots are representing those codes running with the sparse matrix multiply replaced with the new algorithms we talked about. MSA is the one that I described, and I actually don't want you to focus on other things at the moment. Just look at that MSA 1P. So you want it, this is as much as you can get for anything. This is for every single input, you're the fastest. And you know, this plot says, okay, for you can basically say for half of the inputs, you're you know, 25% slower than the best one. So that's how you read this performance profile. The x-axis is parallel runtime relative to the best, and y-axis is the fraction of test cases this is achieved. So MSA is dominant in every single case here. And we have, of course, evaluated a lot of variants of our algorithms, as well as different variants that are implemented in Tim Davis's sparse GraphBLAS. So that's cool. And where am I? I have half an hour into this thing, assuming I've started a couple minutes late, which is a good place to switch gears, to move into a completely different application domain so that I can talk about sparse matrix times tall skinny dense matrix multiply. Now, this is an area that kind of has been increasing in popularity in a way that is really hard to track, called graph neural networks. This code I like a lot because it's actually true. I noticed that graph neural networks is some kind of neural network where you use the graph structure to learn about from your neighbors, in addition to all the other things you're already learning from. And if you haven't heard about graph neural networks, there's no way that I'm gonna explain anything in a couple of slides. But this kind of ebook, I think this is going to become a book, and this is some sort of a teaser version of it for a couple of hundred pages by Bronstein and et al. It's great. It's a little math heavy initially, but it's fun math. Like, it's not like a formulas kind of math. It's a lot of intuition math. It's good stuff. What the code says is graph neural networks, GNNs, can be considered as generalizations of convolutional neural networks, transformers, and so on. And that's indeed true, because a convolution, a standard convolution on an image, is just doing graph convolution on a regular grid, right? And a transformer, you can think of it as a graph neural network in a fully connected structure. Of course, that doesn't mean much, right? Because the more general you get, you lose some performance. Otherwise, we would all be running hypergraphs instead of our graph codes. So there is a trade-off, but it's conceptually, it's more general. And it's been working on a lot of cool problems. Like if you have seen these things in your, Nature Cell, this kind of news that powerful antibiotics discovered using AI. Well, if you look in the covers, this is actually a graph neural network. That's the powerful AI there, or whatever. And there was this really cool paper about how to design chips. In production, in fact, some of those ideas have been used apparently at Google, and they were using an edge-based graph convolutional neural network with a reinforcement learning around it. And so this has also been published in Nature. So there's a lot of use cases of this thing. And if you read under the covers of AlphaFold, this whole protein structure prediction, it is some kind of a graph neural network, this Evo transformer. So there's a lot of applications, and it has graph structure, but it actually has backpropagation and learning. So it's a really cool problem that we started looking at. There is, before I go in, I actually want to say, what can you do with graph neural networks? You can do at the fundamental level 3 things. You can do node classification. You can say, I know properties of certain sets of nodes in my graph. I want to predict the other ones, right? Or it doesn't need to be classification. It can be regression. You might be looking for an actual floating point value. It can be graph classification, which is like, I have lots of little graphs. I know the molecular properties of some graphs. Let's say you're representing your molecules as graphs, and I want to learn the properties of the other graphs. that I don't know yet, right? So typically semi-supervised learning, you know some things about a subset of your data and you want to learn the rest. And finally, you can do link prediction. And this can come really handy when you're trying to, and people use this again for particle physics or metagenomics, where you're trying to figure out what edges are present, which one, going back to the DNA sample thing that we talked about, you can actually use this thing to differentiate between correct edges that you predicted by your software and the wrong ones, just by accumulating from your neighbors. And you might have seen this thing, and I'm not going to go too much into detail, that stochastic gradient descent is, and variance of it, like Adam, is the way to learn a lot of things in deep learning. Graph neural networks is a little tricky because when you look at a convolutional neural network trained on images, each image can be considered fairly independently from each other. So you can say, I'm going to subsample a set of images, I'm going to run my stochastic gradient descent and move to the next one, and so on. This doesn't work as easily and straightforwardly in graph neural networks because things are connected. So you're trying to learn from your neighbors. And if you just subsample a set of nodes, let's say you're trying to do node classification and you run into a deep neural network, what ends up happening is that neural network will require the neighbors you didn't sample in the first place. So then with depth 1, you need vertex 2. With depth 2 on your neural network, you need vertex 2 and 3. And if you look at it in a bigger picture, you'll see that if you have a graph neural network that is modest, like only depth 5, for a lot of networks, you will need to touch every other vertex here because of this small word phenomena in a lot of graphs. So you think that you're running an algorithm that will take like 1% of your running time because you subsampled 1% of your vertices during this training batch. But in the end, you're actually processing everybody. So that's kind of the issue there. And people have been designing sampling-based algorithms for these. That's an active research area. One way to sidestep those things are to train on the whole graph. Instead of doing stochastic gradient descent, you do full gradient descent. And that's what we do here in CAGNet, which is what we call as communication avoiding graph neural networks. So let's give the main idea of what a graph convolution is. It's simply you aggregate the feature vectors, the latent information from your neighbors, you combine it with your own, which I'm not showing here. This is like a plus some learnable parameters of your own embeddings. You combine your neighbor's embeddings with your own and pass it through a nonlinear transformation, and that becomes your next feature vector for forward propagation. I'm just showing, and then for the backward propagation, you're just going to propagate the error and adjust accordingly. So that, if you look at it in the computational angle, what does it mean to aggregate information from my neighbors? It's really, I am a sparse matrix where representing the graph structure, and I have a tall, skinny, dense matrix, and the number of rows is equal to the number of vertices. The number of columns is equal to the whatever feature vector dimension I have, 512. Let's put it that way. Something on hundreds up to 1,000, maybe, depending on the designer of the neural network, right? And if I do this once, I will get to the next feature vector. Again, I'm not putting the nonlinear transformation and the biases there. And I'll do this over and over again. So that is the basic thing in a graph neural network, a graph convolution. There's other concepts like graph attention I'll mention, but that's really the number one thing. So in a deeper picture, this is kind of how it looks like. At each iteration, I am gathering information from my neighbors, and I'm creating a new feature vector for myself. These can be different based on layers. Just like in CNNs, there's different channel sizes for each convolution. Here it can be different too. And there is a mixing matrix that I didn't show that you will have to do that. All the parameters are shared across all the nodes. That's another matrix, dense matrix you have to multiply. But that's usually not going to determine the runtime. Now, Why are we doing it in distributed memory? I want to actually highlight. Now imagine you have L layers, right? Because you're going to do back propagation, you have to keep track of these embeddings. You can't just toss them out when you go to layer 5. You can't toss them out to the layer 4. You have to keep them there because you will use them in back propagation. So they have to stay. For each vertex, you have whatever the feature vector length times the number of layers. So very modest numbers, 100 million, 4 layers, 256 embedding dimensional for average. We're looking at already close to 1 terabyte of memory just to store the embeddings, not to the graph structure, not to all the other overheads. And if you want to solve bigger problems like with billion vertices and deeper networks, you're clearly in trouble range. And you know, there are some big machines that will store 1 terabyte of memory, but not terabyte of GPU memory, right? You want actually GPUs to train these things really fast. So that's why we wanted to do distribute memory GNN training. And really all these things that I have said is mentioned again here. The crux I want to highlight in this figure is not only the forward propagation is a sparse matrix times tall skinny matrix multiplied, the backward propagation also is, which is this, again, A is the sparse matrix representing the adjacency of the graph, G is the gradients of the, there's another one of here, right? So there is actually 2 sparse matrix, tall skinny matrix, dense matrix multipliers here. So that's the primitive that determines the runtime. And that's what we focused on and developed new algorithms, except that you have to actually look at this in a little more holistic way, because you can't just look at it in isolation too much. The way you distribute these sparse matrix and the dense matrix here will determine not only the complexity here, but also the complexity there. Because if you do it too much in favor for this particular case, then you're going to be hurt in the back propagation phase, or you might be hurt when you're doing the multiplication with dense matrix. So there's some more, so to speak, application algorithm co-design there that had to happen. And that kind of allowed us to, this kind of communication avoiding algorithms where we trade memory with communication cost allowed us to scale these problems a little better than not doing so. For example, C equals 1 is the basic way of parallelizing this thing. And what we see for these inputs is if you do it that way, you're not going to get any speed up on a machine like Summit. And this is some reasons behind the reasons behind this is some of it is algorithmic, some of it is how the Summit machine is being designed with 6 GPUs sharing one, network interface card kind of issue. But if you use the communication avoiding algorithm ideas, you can, which is increasing the replication factor. So C equals 2, C equals 4, you're trading memory for reduced communication, you are able to see some speed ups relative to your baseline started. And we of course see much better performance numbers today because we have actually, more balanced machines like Perlmutter available to us in early access program. So we didn't stop there with SpMM. We wanted to say, okay, what else we can look at on these problems? Can we study this SpMM problem, which is not just used for graph neural networks, but also used in certain matrix factorization methods like non-negative matrix factorization and in alternating least squares based methods and so on. And we did actually have a whole different paper on this with different SpMM algorithms. Now, the interesting thing here is, depending on the size of the dense matrices and how dense the sparse matrix is, meaning how many non-zeros per row and column on average, you have different options, right? It's very different. You can choose which one to keep stationary, which one to keep moving. The biggest thing I want to highlight is there's this whole class of algorithms we call 1.5D, and which kind of divide the sparse matrix in a 2D way and the dense matrix in a one-dimensional way. And what it really trades off, in my mind, is instead of doing this multiplication in multiple rounds, which in 2D algorithms you would do, for example, in square root of p rounds. In the best case, you can do this thing in one round. Why? You would gather all the pieces of B you need to multiply with your own A, and then generate a contribution to the output, which you need to reduce with the processors that are in your neighborhood in the process grid, process row. Instead of doing a square root of p stages, you're doing your multiplication in one stage. What are the benefits? Well, reduced latency, of course, but increase arithmetic intensity, because these are sparse codes. And if you do this thing in square root p stages, you're really multiplying small pieces of like this sparse matrix multiplied with this tall skinny thing. And then again, this one is multiplied with the next tall skinny thing. This actually hurts the arithmetic intensity. You can write it down and see that you're streaming the sparse matrix over and over again. By doing it in one iteration, you're just actually streaming the sparse matrix only once to do the whole thing. What is the trade-off? The trade-off is at some point you need to kind of keep all these, not only just your blue dense matrix, you also need to keep the whole gray stuff as well. So it increases your memory consumption temporarily by a factor of C. And as a rule of thumb, you can use C to be square root of P. And then what we saw as the result was 1.5D algorithms are consistently better. So let's look at first the ones that say BS. It doesn't stand for bullshit, it stands for bulk synchronous. And if you look at those, the 1.5D algorithms for a lot of these are consistently better than 2D, right? You can see this purple line dominating the green and the blue. So indeed, that trade-off pays off, right? So that's good. But what was really surprising to us is these 2D algorithms, which are AS, which is asynchronous algorithms written with one-sided RDMA, were faster across the board. It doesn't scale much beyond that for maybe several reasons. One is that it's really hard to scale beyond those runtimes. It's already fast. The other reason is it's not using the collectives of MPI like the bulk synchronous algorithms do. The collectives have favorable communication scaling because of the way they are implemented, whereas the asynchronous algorithms are, go and fetch that matrix point to point. So they don't have that nice behavior of scaling. They do have nice things though. You can spread out the communication cost throughout the whole runtime of the computation, because different processors can actually make progress at different times, as opposed to compute, communicate, and then in the compute phase, the network is underutilized in the bulk synchronous algorithms. So what we found out was asynchronous algorithms was consistently faster, but they didn't scale very well. And the 1.5D algorithms were consistently faster and scaled better than 2D algorithms. So that's another study. And I'm going to basically finish my whole selection of algorithmic innovations with something called a sample dense matrix multiplier for completeness. We talked about this in the beginning when I showed this big pictures, but it turns out that a lot of this sparse matrix dense tall skinny matrix multiply is coupled with this thing called a sample dense matrix multiply. And it has use cases in graph neural networks with self-attention, collaborative filtering for alternative least squares, and so on. And what does it really mean is, here's the picture. In general, for example, in graph attention, if you know what that means, is you want to learn the weights of how you're going to scale your neighbor's contributions before you do graph convolution. In the picture I showed with graph convolution, you were not doing that thing. You were just treating every one of your neighbors is equal. But the attention mechanism allows you to say, this neighbor has information that's more valuable to me. And this is learned, of course, through the optimization backpropagation process. This is not like something that's fixed parameter. And the way you would learn is the attention scheme is just sample dense matrix multiply. They say, look at on your neighbors, which is the graph structures, and you compute a variant of inner product between your feature vectors and your neighbor's feature vectors, scaled by some nonlinear transformation again to get the weight that you will use for that neighbor. And that's SDDMM, sample dense matrix multiply, and always, almost always coupled with SpMM afterwards, because after you learn the weights, you do the aggregation. Now, here's the not so unsurprising fact, which is these computations are awfully similar. There's one sparse matrix, two dense matrices involved in both of them. And really, every non-zero in the sparse matrix signifies that you have to make an interaction between a row of dense matrix 1 and a row of dense matrix 2, A and B. So what does that mean? You can basically take every distributed algorithm that you know for SpMM and mechanically convert to an algorithm for sample dense matrix multiply with identical communication characteristics. So that's actually, that was really useful and very profound for what Vivek has found. And there's a method for this, right? So you just, mechanically transform your input to an output, initialize it to 0, change your output to an input, replace your local update from this to that. And then in the end, you get the identical sample dense matrix multiply with the same communication cost. And of course, this paper includes, if SDDMM is always followed by SpMM, there is this obvious question is, how can I take advantage of this fact that these are always coming in sequence? How can I reduce the, there's two strategies to reduce communication. One of them is this, what we call a local kernel fusion. The other one is called the replication reuse. Remember, in communication avoiding algorithms, we replicate the data either temporarily or permanently to reduce communication. Now we have a sequence of operations. How can we only replicate operations once? Well, only replicate matrices once, and that's what we call replication reuse. And the local kernel fusion is different and in fact mutually exclusive compared to this thing. And they changed the optimal replication factor. The optimal replication factor is different for unoptimized back-to-back calls of SDDMM and SpMM. It's different for replication reuse, and it's different for local kernel fusion. Sorry, I was trying to actually to go over my notes as opposed to changing the slides. So this has been all studied, and the optimal factors have been listed on the paper. You can find it on arXiv, and there's a whole selection process about which matrix to replicate, which matrix to propagate, and whether it makes more sense to replicate the dense matrix and the sparse matrix. And these are all based on the ratio of the non-zeros in the sparse matrix to the dense matrix. Due to time, I won't spend too much time anymore on this thing, but we have quite a bit of good results. The takeaway message was that you can get, two things were in the takeaway from this paper. One is you can take any SpMM algorithm and get an SDDMM algorithm. And these strategies of replication reuse and local kernel fusion will get you about 30% reduction in communication costs compared to an unoptimized sequence of these operations. It's time for me to wrap up. I want to advertise GraphBLAS, which is really the catch-all thing for doing all these algorithms. So this is somewhat fascinating. You might have heard about GraphBLAS. This is our effort to standardize graph algorithms in the language of sparse matrices and matrices in general. But I have talked about, like 80% of my time today in the talk was spent on non-graph stuff. So you might be seeing that the primitives that I use for GraphBLAS are applicable to, protein sequence similarity, graph neural networks, and so on. So you can use these GraphBLAS primitives for many, many other things. And all these 7 different variants of sparse matrix multiply is actually captured with one signature there in the GraphBLAS API, which is this big GRB MXM. With that, I think I'm not going to spend anything to say on the software part. We have a CombBLAS 2.0. If you're interested in, check it out. We have listed all the innovations we have done for the last decade on CombBLAS, which is a distributed memory library for sparse matrices that does all these things that I talked to you about. And 80% of the codes that I talked about today are part of CombBLAS or will be in CombBLAS. So check out this new paper on that. It's pretty much, it shows you the evolution of CombBLAS over the years and how it compares to competitors today. There's a GPU version of these primitives implemented in GraphBLAS, which has actually been completed 2 years ago. Took quite some time to get published. Does most of these things we talked about today as well on the GPU, single GPU so far. And it was pretty competitive by the time we benchmarked it, but that was again 2 years ago. So my conclusions are sparse matrix techniques underlie computations from many different fields, like the scientific computing has been the historical one. Machine learning, graph analytics, and bioinformatics is what I've talked about. The GraphBLAS API already seem to have the right abstraction because we need the semi-rings to do many different computations, like the sequence alignments and so on. And the masks gives us an opportunity not to do redundant computation on things that we don't need. And we really, of course, want those things to be in this extreme scale parallel settings for the big problems we want to solve. And for those, we usually utilize techniques like data structure design and communication avoiding algorithms. And with that, I want to acknowledge a lot of people who contributed this and people who gave us money to do so. And thank you for your patience on this version 1 of this talk. I clearly need to delete some slides.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aydın. Wonderful talk. I learned quite a bit. Before we move to the Q&A, I just want to have a quick advertisement for our next SPCL BCAST seminar, which will be on the 7th of April, 2 weeks. This same time, except if you're in the US or Asia, it's an hour earlier because Europe is going through daylight savings time this weekend. We'll have Karthik Kashnath of NVIDIA talking about their Earth-2 initiative for building digital twins and recent work on their forecast net for using deep neural networks to predict weather.